It's time to break out your dice bag and your treasure tokens as we go over the last of the precons from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, Most Wanted. Welcome to or welcome back to my channel today, and we're going to go over the Most Wanted precon, including the exclusive cards it contained within and some upgrade suggestions I would make to make the deck slightly better. So let's start off with the front-facing commander from this precon, Olivia Opulent Outlaw. For 1 red, white, and a black, you get a legendary creature, Vampire Assassin with flying and lifelink. It's a 3/3 that says whenever one or more outlaws you control deal combat damage to a player, create a treasure token, and you can pay 3 and sack 2 treasures to put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. Activate only as a sorcery. So Olivia Voldaren has picked up a color compared to every other version of her that she has never had before, but now she actually doesn't care about vampires. Instead, it's all about outlaws. If any of the 5 creature types that are outlaws hit an opponent, you get a treasure token per opponent hit, which then gets fed to her other ability to make an army of outlaws more dangerous. And the concept of outlaws grouping together as a creature type is an interesting design space, and it could mean in the future we could see other creature types kind of get bundled together for a similar purpose. The second commander that comes in the deck and also cares about what outlaws are doing is Vihan Goldwaker. For red, white, black, it's Dwarf Warlock. Other outlaws you control have vigilance and haste, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may have treasures you control become 3/3 construct assassin artifact creatures in addition to their other types until end of turn, and he is also a 3/3. This is a really strong commander without being overpowered. It doesn't feed its own ability and requires you to build around it to maximize it, but being that it's pretty nutty, it is at odds with what Olivia wants to be doing, because Olivia wants to sack the treasures to buff everything. Vihan wants to turn them into outlaws to attack with, but Olivia makes treasures that Vihan can animate, so it's an odd relationship, but he's just too good to not use in the deck. There will be a Vihan deck in the future with him at the lead, but for now, Olivia keeps her post in this video. Moving off of the commanders, let's take a look at Angelic Sellsword. 4 and a white, Angel Mercenary, flying vigilance. When it or another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token with tap. Target creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery, and whenever it attacks, if its power is 6 or higher, draw a card, and it's a 4/4 to start out with. Okay, so I really like the design of this card. Any creature that you cast once this thing is down is going to get you a new outlaw on the board, and it can draw you cards if it gets buffed up. One activation of Olivia into the +1/+1 counters will do it, or a couple of these mercenary tokens activating before combat will do it as well. I like that this gives extra creatures for Olivia's counters to go onto, and these little unassuming 1/1s can become quite dangerous if Olivia is allowed to drop counters on them. Then we have Ride at Dawn. For 2 and a white, it's an enchantment. Legendary creature spells you control have Convoke. It has whenever a commander attacks, create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token with tap. Target creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. The important part of this card is the Convoke part. It allows us to cast our commander back to the board easier if they die to removal in combat, as well as using all these spare token creatures if they were like mana rocks for casting legendary creatures. The 1/1 creation part is just a nice bonus. Then we have an interesting reanimation card in Back in Town. X2 and a black sorcery, return X target outlaw creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. First thing that comes to mind here is this is an easier variation of Agadeem's Awakening to cast, and for this deck, it's great. You get wiped, well, you can just bring back all the outlaws and try again. It's simple, it's powerful, and it can really ruin your opponent's plans by bringing everything back that they just destroyed, or you could wipe yourself with the board here and then just use the treasures and stuff that the deck produces to bring them right back. There's a lot of possibilities with this card. Then we would have what I would call a black version of an Eternal Witness in Charred Grave Robber. 2 and a black, Skeleton Mercenary. When it enters the battlefield, return target outlaw card from your graveyard to your hand, and it escapes for 3 and a black, and when it escapes, it comes in with a +1/+1 counter on it, and it's a 3/1 to start with. Not the most exciting card in the world, but it is quite serviceable. But like I said, it's kind of like an Eternal Witness for outlaw cards, with the idea that you can bring it back later if you need to. But that plan is kind of counterintuitive, because you might actually be having to exile cards that you want to get back with it. So it kind of limits its targets once you start escaping. But all in all, it's still a pretty strong card. Then we have some color pie bleeding going on with Discreet Retreat. For 3 and a black, it's an enchantment aura, enchant land. Enchanted land has tap, add 2 manas of any one color. color, and you get to spend the mana only to cast outlaw spells or activate abilities from outlaw sources. And whenever you cast your first outlaw spell each turn, you draw a card and lose 1 life. Green is the color that usually gets auras that attach to lands and that increase the mana output of that land when it's tapped for mana, but this is made up for the limiting factor of only being able to mess with outlaws and their abilities. But this does give us a nice recurring draw trigger when we cast an outlaw each turn, making it into kind of a bad Phyrexian arena. But it's still very playable though. Just remember that you won't get a card off of the outlaw tokens that get made. It has to be a cast card to get the trigger. Then we have what I think could possibly be a trap card for newer players. Dead Before Sunrise, 3 in a red instant. Until end of turn, outlaw creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain tap. This creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature. This has a couple purposes. One is really good and the other is overcosted and very, very bad, and that's where the trap comes in. The terrible trap thing here is you use it as a combat trick just to punch extra damage through, and unless that attack is going to wipe out at least one opponent, do not do that. Instead, it's all about the removal part of the spell, where just before your turn, you cast this, you tap all your outlaws to blow up the blockers to clear your lanes, and then you go to hit your opponent. One funny interaction that you could slot into the deck, I'm not going to do it here, is with Repercussion. With that down, not only do you get to blast away their creatures, the damage dealt will also smack them in the face and could be very bad for their longevity in the game. Then we have a variation on graveyard mechanics to sort of get your stuff back, even though it's only going to be for 1 shot, and that is Grey Water's Fixer. For 2, a black and a red, you have a Lizard Mercenary that says each outlaw creature in your graveyard has Encore X, where X is its mana value. It means you exile the card for its mana cost out of your graveyard. You make a token copy for each of your opponents. They get to swing because they have haste, and then at the end of the turn, you sacrifice them, and it's a 4/4, and you can only do this at sorcery speed. So like I said, this kind of lets you get them back, but it's just it's a one-time performance to get one last hit in. But there's a couple of things to remember about Encore if you run cards that can copy tokens or token doublers. Things that can copy tokens, such as a populate trigger off of Song of the World Soul making a copy, you get to keep that copied token, as the sacrifice bit for the Encore part isn't the token, it's part of the Encore ability resolving. You don't get haste on those copies though, and you don't have to sacrifice them. However, if you run a token doubler or a tripler, such as O'Hare Talk, you get the 3 tokens created by that Encore ability, but each of them gains the haste and have to be sacrificed at the end of the turn. It's just the way that they were created. One was after the Encore resolved, and one is part of the resolution of the Encore. Either way, this is a pretty good card, and if you don't care about losing your cards permanently, it's just a good way to bring stuff back. The best card from this precon I can see to Encore with this is Angrath's Marauders, because the damage doubling off this thing stacks for each copy it makes. So if you Encore this in a full pod, you're going to have 6 times the damage for the turn that those Encore copies are coming down in a full pod. So do with that what you will. And the last card exclusive to this precon is Bounty Board. For 3 colorless, as an artifact, tap to add 1 mana of any color. Not exactly the most exciting thing. The good thing here is 1 in the tap, put a bounty counter on target creature, activate only as a sorcery. Whenever the creature with the bounty counter on it dies, each of its controller's opponents draw a card and gain 2 life. You know, it's just a generic mana rock on the surface, but that real money is in that activated ability. Spread the bounty counters around and cards will flow as things start getting destroyed or die in combat. Now, next I'll talk about the cards I wanted to swap around. Now, this was actually a lot more difficult than I anticipated, because I thought this deck was going to be the easiest deck to upgrade, and it was actually the hardest because there's so many choices to pick from. So with that said, let's take a look and see what I'm talking about taking out and putting back in. I'll go ahead and give you the removal and then the immediate swap out. Let's start off with Aetherborn Marauder. It's, you know, it's okay. It's a 2/2 for 4 with flying lifelink that grows based on the number of counters, but this card can be a dead card if you either don't have counters already on things able to sit in your hand. It's terrible to cast just as a 2/2. And you don't really want to weaken your other creatures unless you have a way to punch this through right away. Instead, I want to include a copy from the main set, Boneyard Desecrator. For the same mana cost of 3 and a black, it's a 3/4 zombie mercenary with menace. 1 and a black, sack another creature, put a counter on the Desecrator, and if it was an outlaw, you create a treasure token. We're going to have all these mercenary tokens lying around, and creatures are going to die in combat or, die in other ways. So if they're going to die, you go ahead and just sack them, feed it into the Desecrator. You're going to end up getting a treasure token out of it, and this thing grows bigger and turns itself into a very big threat eventually. The next removal is going to be Shiny Impetus, 2 and a red. It's an enchantment aura, enchanted creature. Enchanted creature is +2/+2 and goaded, and when the enchanted creature attacks, you create a treasure token. Now this helps our treasure theme, but I hate the impetus cards in the precons. Ever since they started making these things, at least one of them shows up in almost every single precon that's ever been printed since, and they're not that good. Basically, you put it on a creature, and that creature is probably going to die within a couple of turns, and you might net 1 or 2 treasures off this. That's about it. And I just don't like it. The only impetus that is any good is Ghoulish Impetus, and that's because it keeps coming back, whereas this is, it's gone, it's gone. Instead, I want to use an enchantment from the main set called Rakish Crew. For 2 and a black enchantment, enters the battlefield, create a mercenary token, and whenever an outlaw you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. So this is, for the same mana value as the impetus, we're going to get an outlaw version of Bastion of Remembrance, but you get the 1/1 mercenary token instead. So that I like this a lot better, because we're going to have things dying, and this will actually get us some good value out of that. Then we're going to remove what I would consider a very slow mana rock from the deck, Glittering Stockpile, 2 and a red. It's an artifact treasure. Tap and add a red, put a stash counter on the stockpile, or then tap and sack it at X mana of any one color, where X is the number of stash counters on the Glittering Stockpile. I've never been very impressed with this mana rock, and it takes just a little too long for the payoff from it. Instead, let's jump back into the main set and grab a new outlaw in Claim Jumper. For 2 and a white, you get a Rabbit Mercenary. It's a 3/3 with Vigilance, that when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you can search your library for a Plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then if an opponent controls more lands than you, repeat the process once. If you search your library this way, shuffle. So I like the Claim Jumper instead, because you're going to get immediate results if somebody's ahead of you. It's got a decent body attached to it. It's another mercenary for us to operate off of in the deck. There's just a lot of good things going for this card that I would prefer over the Glittering Stockpile. Then we're going to remove a conditional card draw in Idol of Oblivion, 2 colorless artifact, tap and draw a card, but you can only activate it if you create a token this turn. You have 8 and tap, sacrifice Idol of Oblivion, create a 10/10 colorless Eldrazi creature token. I don't like the conditional part of this to get a card, because I can't really reliably use it on my opponent's turn. I'd have to use it on my turn most of the time, and sometimes that matters, and I really don't care about the Eldrazi token in this particular deck, so I'm removing it. It's a 10/10, it's big, but we don't have many ways of forcing it through to hit them when they can just chump block it all the time. Instead, I'm going to put something in that I can activate off turn if I need to in Collector's Vault. Not only do we get to draw without needing the token, this thing actually pays, pay 2 into it, tap, draw a card, discard a card. You get to create a treasure token feeding our treasures off of this, and I like this much better. Then we have a card that's kind of an all-star in like a 1v1 format, and that is Council's Judgment. 1 white sorcery. Starting with you, each player votes for a non-land permanent you don't control. Exile each permanent with the most votes or tied for the most votes. See, that's pretty good. You pay 3, you get to exile anything you want, basically. And sometimes you can net 2 things if they guess the wrong thing, because the votes are tied. However, in a 4-player game, you're going to have to play heavy politics to get this thing to actually hit what you want. And oftentimes you're not going to. And something that you don't want exiled is going to get caught. And sometimes you might even get your own stuff caught up if there's a 3 or a 4-way tie on some of this stuff. Instead, I'm going to add an on-theme board wipe in Blood Money. 5 black sorcery. Destroy all creatures for each non-token creature destroyed. This way, you create a tapped treasure token. So this will just give us more treasures to operate off of, and we don't have to mess with the messy politics and hope we hit the thing we want to get rid of. We just blow everything up, get the treasures, and no muss, no fuss. Then we have a card that is just awful, and that is Hex. For 4 black sorcery, destroy 6 target creatures. The problem with this kind of thing is you have to have 6 targets to use it, or you can't even cast the spell. It is dead in your hand and will sit there dead until you hit that 6 targets. And sometimes you may even have to target your own stuff just to get rid of something if you really need to, and I don't like that. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and use by invitation only. For 3 white, you get a sorcery, choose any number between 0 and 13, and each player sacks that many creatures. We are going to hit our own stuff, but we have so many of these tokens to work with in the mercenaries that we should be able to eat a chunk of our opponent's boards without affecting us too heavily and still get kind of the desired board wipe effect that we want without relying on the targets being there. It also has the added benefit over the hex of being able to destroy indestructible creatures and things with hexproof, because you can't target those things, so it's just a good way to get around those effects. I'm also removing Mass Mutiny. 3 red sorcery for each opponent, gain control of up to 1 creature they control. They untap, they gain haste. This is not a Rakdos sacrifice style deck. We don't have a bunch of ways of feeding these things into anything once we've swung with them. It's just like, okay, I'm gonna take your stuff and swing with it one time, that's it, goodbye. And it's just not that good of a thing. It's no, I don't care for the effect in this deck. And instead, we're going to include one of the new spree cards, Great Train Heist. It has a starting of a red, and you have to pick one of the 3 spree modes on it and add it to that red. So for 2 red, you untap all creatures you control, and if it's your combat phase, there's an additional combat after this phase, so you have to cast it on your combat phase. Don't wait until your second main to cast this, or you won't get that effect. Plus 2 to the red, so 2 in a red. Creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain first strike, so you get a nice big boost across the board. Or for red, choose target opponent. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to that player this turn, create a tapped treasure token. So if you're able to combine multiple modes, such as untap and do the combat and get treasures, you can smack your opponent a couple of different times and get 2 sets of treasures off of those things. So that's pretty good. So I like that. It's kind of a good card. It fits the theme, and I like having it in here. Then we have a card that I've never been able to get work, and I think it's a little too cute, and that is Dire Fleetravager. For 3 black, 4/4, Orc Pirate Wizard, Menace and Death Touch. When it enters the battlefield, each player loses 1/3 of their life, rounded up. It's just, this can hurt you more than your opponents if you're already ahead of life total, so you're actually going to lose more of a percentage of your life than they are. So I'm not a big fan of this card, and I've never been able to really get it to work. So instead, we're going to go back to that main set. We're going to grab Laughing Jasper Flint. For 1 black and a red, it's a 4/3 Lizard Rogue. Creatures you control but don't own are mercenaries in addition to their other types, and at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top X cards of target opponent's library, where X is the number of outlaws you control. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among those cards and mana of any type to cast those spells. Since we're loaded up with outlaws in this deck, it should be really easy to score a lot of opportunities off of this thing to get extra cards out of our opponent's decks. And we should be able to cast the things we exiled off of the treasures that we're making up. And plus, anything that you temporarily steal with something like the Captivating Crew, which is included in the PRECON, they will become outlaws while you have Flint out, which may be relevant during combat. Then I'm going to take out a card that I think is kind of just mediocre, and that is Mist Meadow Skulk. For 1 and a white, 1/1 Kithkin Rogue with lifelink, protection for mana value 3 or greater. I don't like this card just simply because it can be blocked by all these 1/1 mercenary tokens and any other 1/1 tokens for that matter. A mana dork can block it and just destroy it. And it's not that great until we can actually get some counters stacked up on it to make sure it survives past those little chump blocks. So instead, once more, back into the main set, let's grab Vile Smasher, Gleeful Grenadier. For black, red, it's a 3/2 Goblin Mercenary that says whenever another outlaw enters the battlefield under your control, Vile Smasher will deal 1 damage to target opponent. So it doesn't matter if it's the token creatures, the token mercenaries coming off of stuff, or whether it's just the stuff that you're casting, or if you have any kind of flickering effect you want to add to this deck, you will get this trigger off of Vile Smasher and deal damage, and these pot shots might actually add up over time. Then we have another rogue I'm going to get rid of in Humble Defector. 1 in a red, 2/1. Draw 2 cards. Target opponent gains control of Humble Defector. Activate only during your turn. I don't want to give opponents creatures or cards for that matter, and there's a good chance your opponents will just simply bounce this thing back and forth between themselves to draw cards, never giving it back to you. So it's equivalent of, draw 2, discard a card, draw 2 almost, because you're losing the Defector, there's your discard, and then they're either going to give it to each other, or they're going to sacrifice it to some effect that they have. So you're never going to see more than the 2 cards off of it, so I'm not a big fan. So instead, let's go and grab Hellspur Posse Boss, main set once again. 2 red, 2/4 Lizard Rogue. Other outlaws you control have haste, and whenever it enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 red mercenary tokens. So this is going to really help us with the value of the deck, gives us more things that are on theme, and grants everything haste in the deck, and a pair of bodies to swing in with, or to tap and pump up something. I'm also going to take out Direfleet Daredevil. For 1 and a red, it's a 2/1 human pirate with first strike. When it enters the battlefield, exile an instant or sorcery from an opponent's graveyard, and you can cast it this turn, and mana of any type can be spent to cast the spell. If that spell would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, cast or exile it instead. So I'm not a huge fan of this card. More often than not, when I've ever tried to use it, it sits dead in your hand more often than I care to admit, and it's just because you're waiting on something decent to swipe, and it just feels awful to cast this as a 2/1 first striker without using that flashback option for the opponent's spells. So instead, I want to do something to get cards back from our graveyard instead with Vat of Rebirth. For a black, you got an artifact that says whenever another artifact or creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on it, and then 2 and a black, remove 4 oil counters from Vat of Rebirth and tap it. Return target creature from the graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So we have all these treasures that we're going to be sacking. We're going to have guys dying in combat and other things going on. So it's pretty easy to get the counters on this thing pretty high and keep them rolling and just keep bringing stuff back that has been destroyed or at an inopportune time or gotten taken out in combat. Then the last removal I'm going to make in this deck is actually one of the exclusive cards of the Precon in We Ride at Dawn. We had talked about this just a little while ago. It's the one that gives legendary creatures Convoke and makes a mercenary token when the commanders attack. The problem with this is the usefulness of this card in this build of the deck is just kind of limited because the Convoke ability only works on legendary creatures, and there is not a great deal of legends in this deck. It's only about maybe a third or so of the creatures in the deck that are legendaries, and the ones that we have aren't that expensive to begin with. They only cost like 3-4 mana at most. So the token creation on top of that, it just isn't enough for this to be played over the final replacement card. In Pitiless Plunderer, for 3 and a black, you get a 1/4 human pirate that says whenever another creature you control dies, create a treasure token. I mean, this is just the ultimate in treasure-making creatures. If something dies, you get it, and it works out. It's an outlaw that gives us treasures as things die, and it has become much more affordable thanks to 2 recent reprintings in LCI's commander decks as well as the Fallout commander decks. So you get some options here to get this at a much lower price now. And finally, just as I did with the other precons, these are what I would call the pricey / power upgrades. These things cost about $10 or more every time you find them, but they are really good and they would fit in these decks very well. First up is Massacre Girl, known killer, for 2 black, 4/4 human assassin with menace. Creatures you control have wither, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was 1 or less than 1, draw a card. So the big thing here is just it's another outlaw for us to work with, but it gives our creatures wither, and as our creatures start growing off of Olivia, this is going to make it harder and harder for them to block without losing their stuff. And then of course it also punches through any kind of indestructible defenses as well. I'd also want to include a copy of Black Market Connections. For 2 and a black enchantment. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, choose 1 or more. Create a treasure token, lose 1 life, draw a card, lose 2 life, or create a 3/2 colorless shapeshifter creature token with changeling and you lose 3 life. So those changelings are going to be outlaws for us. We also get to have treasures for the deck's theme. So I really like this card in this deck, but right now it's around $20. The next card though is a little less expensive. It's around $10. It's Grim Hireling. For 3 and a black, you get a Tiefling Rogue 3/2 that says whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage, create 2 treasure tokens, and then you can pay a black and sack X treasures to neg X a target creature until end of turn. This is really good because it does stack with Olivia's ability. So if something hits while this thing and Olivia are down, you're going to get 3 treasures off of the opponent that got hit, and it's per opponent that got hit. So it's pretty good. I really like this. I'm hoping that this one gets a reprint soon just so it's a little more available, but I like this card in the deck, and if you're wanting to go with a cheaper of the pricey upgrades, this is the one to get. Now we're going to get into the 2 most expensive cards that I would suggest to add to this deck. First one is not as expensive as the last, and that is Anointed Procession. For 3 and a white. If an effect were to create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many instead. Of course, with all the mercenary tokens, all the treasure tokens getting made, I could not resist putting this in the deck. Make a treasure off Olivia, now you get 2. Encore creatures with Grey Waters Fixer, now those are doubled up. Just remember that the double token off of the Encore ability has haste and has to be sacrificed off of this thing if you use it. And the last one, you guys should be able to guess this. It is the ultimate in Outlaws in terms of price. Dockside Extortionist for 1 and a red, 1/2 Goblin Pirate enters the battlefield, create X treasure tokens, where X is the number of artifacts and enchantments your opponents control. This thing is currently sitting around $80 even after it was reprinted in Double Masters 2022. And we're just waiting for the next reprint because this thing is just disgustingly expensive. And I'm hoping soon, maybe Modern Horizons 3, who knows? Maybe this will see some kind of reprint. But until then, this is going to be an expensive upgrade, but it will give you a lot in return, giving you treasures to feed into this deck. And it's just a great card. So with that said, that was the most wanted pre-con. Like I said, I had a lot of trouble. There was a lot of cards I did not get to put in this thing because I just couldn't decide on what else I wanted to cut. And it was kind of jumbling up the power of the deck. So I decided to cut bait and give these as my suggestions. But you have lots of options that you could add into this thing. Let me know what you think of those suggestions down in the comments below. And if you like what I'm doing while you're down there, please like, comment, subscribe. All these things help as I'm on my way to my first 1,000 subscribers. As for the pre-cons themselves, since this is the last one, which of these pre-cons would I get? I think I would get the most wanted one just because I have a much wider array of options to work off of. The plant one is pretty good too. Desert Bloom, that one is really good to give you options as well, and it's pretty powerful. I would say the Quick Draw one is next in line, and then the Grand Larceny is probably my least favorite deck. It just doesn't, it's hard to make it flow. You have to have patience and you have to have a lot of skill to understand how to operate it. It's a very chaotic deck because you just don't know what you're going to get off of your opponents. But if you like chaos, then it's actually a pretty fun deck to pilot. Let me know what you think of that as well. What is your favorite precon from this series of precons? And as always, thank you guys for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.